365 days on paper. So, just to give some context, Nicole, Emmanuel, and I started this place way back when. It was 3 years ago now, I think. And it was a book and furniture store. Yeah, it was a store. But we had bigger visions for it. We were about connection, collaboration. We wanted to create a space where people would congregate like this. So Nina's book feels like a true culmination of what we set out to do. And that's a really beautiful thing, you know? Nina came to the store, I think, in the early days. It was a good few years ago. And straight away, like, conversations began. A relationship was forged between us all. And a really good connection and a friendship, you know? And through that, Emmanuel and I started discussing more in depth about her work. And specifically this body of work, which is this really interesting deep dive into time and space. It's quite meditative. And we were really into the project, so we started talking about and collaborating on how we could bring this to life. And here it is. It's culminated in this book, but it's also an object, it's also an art piece, and whichever way you want to look at it. So the journey has been a beautiful one and really enjoyable, and we're incredibly proud with the end result, and now it's time for you guys to buy one.
He's the owner of the shop.
And we're really blessed and honoured to have Damien Cave from the New York Times. So I'm going to pass it over to them to dive a bit deeper into the whole topic and the book in conversation. So thanks everyone.
Thank you. Feels a lot of all of you standing and surrounding us, but you comfortable? Yeah, convenient. But this will just be a casual chat with a mix of big ideas and very specific text. One of the things that I think is fascinating, most of you probably know the work, but anything that's a combination of fact and reality and journalism and art will forever be an interest to me. But there's also something profound and deep about this idea in this project. You have not just the attempt to create something visual from the reality and the chaos of life. You have something that's done 365 days. You have something that's done, rain or shine in a way that attempts to create patterns from the chaos that is life and the chaos that is journalism. So I figured we could start with your process. And the first question I have for you is, how did this come about? It's the obvious question. What were you doing the day before you started this project? And what on earth made you decide to take this on?
Well, okay, that is a very good question. Before I answer that, I would actually just like to thank you, Damien Cave, the Australian Bureau Chief of the New York Times, for being here and agreeing to do this, which is wonderful, and to Marcus, Emmanuel, and Nicole for hosting and just being such an integral part of this process. And I can tell you that it would not exist without them, or the New York Times. So I'm grateful to all of you. So the process, so how it started. So, I've been doing drawings for a while, like little grid drawings, and I'm like, what am I, it's always the question with abstract work, like, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing this? Why am I intrigued to do this? And so I was sort of just making them, not really knowing what I was doing, as I often do. And on I think it was the 28th of September in 2020, which was, we're 7 months into COVID, and I don't think we were in lockdown in Sydney, but we were here on Ireland in Australia at that time. But it was a weird moment, right? So the US election was coming and stuff was happening. And at 4 a.m. I sort of wake up kind of from a dream, and it was like something landed like in my brain, like do this. And it was like, make a work 365 days and track yourself through time and track what is happening in the world at that moment. and your experience and the world's experience. And I'm like, whoa, that's a lot. Like 365 days doing these drawings, which take, so each of those days takes about an hour to do the drawing, and I draw it square by square by square by square. So it's quite a commitment. And I had to really think, like, it was like a proposition had been made to me, and I had to think about whether I wanted to accept, but I didn't know whether I could accept. But it became really important as a way of just coping with that time, because it was, I mean, I was at home, my life was really small, you know, like in lockdown a lot of the time. I was really separated from a lot of my family during that time, and somehow that relief of just having to do something, not having to think, just do it, made me kind of cope with the news that I was getting every day, this deluge. So yeah, it was just this thing that it was presented to me as an idea. I don't know where it came from, my deep unconscious maybe, and I said yes, and once I said yes, then I was in.
And as you were sort of getting into it, did your idea of it or what it meant to you change? I mean, one of the things that you're working through is time, right?
Yeah.
So was there a beginning, middle, and end? Were there ups and downs? What were the moments that you?
Oh, so many. Like the first week, I'm like, oh, this is fantastic. This is such a good idea. And then the second week, I'm like, oh my God, what did I do? This is terrible. This is terrible. Like every day. And like you think about your day, like, okay, we have how many waking hours in a day? You know, 18, 16 waking hours in a day. But like to do something like an hour a day, I'm not very good with routines. I'm not very good with, I'm quite disciplined if I want to do something, but I'm not hugely disciplined, you know, like exercise and like things like that I'm not great at. And so it became a thing which, it was like I was an employee. Like I had to show up for work. And some days I didn't want to show up for work, I just had to do it. And then other days it became a solace, like thank God I can show up for work because this is what I can do. And over time, as it accumulated, my sister who's here, who's a surgeon, since actually when I was doing my PhD, which I think was the second year doing it, where I was really stressed out on how am I going to do my dissertation, and she said to me, you know, you can only eat an elephant one bite at a time. And I thought about it, I was like, oh, that's true. so just one day at a time. And something happens. I started to really enjoy that sense of a cumulative body of work that had like quite a deeper meaning, and it wasn't about whether I liked it or not, it wasn't about whether I wanted to do it or not, it was just the thing in and of itself. It was asking something of me and I did it.
I'm glad you mentioned meaning. Like, well, I'm curious, what does it mean to you now? What was there a goal that you had? And in our previous conversation that we had, we talked a bit about that desire to sort of retreat from the chaos of the news and your past is the compass, the order that comes from that particular world.
Yeah.
How did you incorporate your past? How did that past career kind of shape what you were trying to do here?
Yeah, so I don't know, for those who don't know, I'm an economist, an artist, a lawyer. I have a lot of hats that I wear. And my work in economics was in microeconomics, so around sort of game theory and sort of decision making under constraints. So I'm always interested in what are the constraints and how do people operate within constraints. And so, you know, when I was in academia, I was looking at the real world and, you know, thinking up models and, you know, like writing these sort of deep mathematical equations about how people behave when they're presented with a certain set of circumstances. And so here I am, I guess I'm presented with a certain set of circumstances, which is COVID, the world, my life. And I kind of, I guess, used that same technique of creating some constraints for myself. And then I kind of wanted to see what I was going to do with them. So it's kind of not that different, except I was the subject of the experiment, so to speak. And so it's always that thing like, how do people operate under conditions of limitation? How do you find freedom when it looks like there is none? And it turns out, if you actually really confine yourself to a very, very limited set of circumstances, it somehow makes life easier like it just sort of like there is actually a huge degree of freedom. You know, there are many ways that you can express individuality. You know, so each of these grid drawings are different. They're all kind of in one regard they're all the same, but they're all different. And so I think I'm always like trying to figure out how to live optimally. That's very commonest I think to say, but to optimize. So this is my version of optimizing during this time is to make a book. Like what else would you do?
I mean, the thing that's sort of fascinating, and now I'm going to like pull out these beautiful books, is, and I don't even know if we talked about this before, but I don't even know if you knew this, but within that idea of constraints, within journalism, we have our own constraints, right? And so Nina chose what in the New York Times we call the lead of the paper. So the story in the right top corner of the New York Times was the one that she chose. And within our culture, that's the most constrained place in the newspaper. And even as we become more digital, that's the piece that has to be written a certain way. And the headlines have to be a certain length because it runs down the right side of the paper. And it's still that very much that print culture. And so for me, going through this and reading, and I'm going to read a few excerpts, so just to remind us of the kinds of constraints that you're talking about here, right? So this is, I picked these, not quite at random. January 7th, 2021. Trump incites mob, rampage in Capitol, forces evacuations.
By the way, it's January 7th, not January 6th, because it's the printed edition.
Yes.
This is the old school, you know, it's like I use the print edition rather than the website, because the website's always changing, so I wanted something that was fixed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So fish wrap, as we like to call it.
Fish wrap, okay.
Lives for a day, and then it's dead, and then it's red. That's the culture that we come from, despite our village. So, but each of these headlines is particular in a particular length, and there's something poetic about it because of those constraints, right? So this is January 24th, 2021. Shouting, smashed glass, a lunge, then a gunshot. This is again the story of January 6th, and one of the women who was killed in the attack on the Capitol. Skipping ahead, this one is sort of random, but a bit surprising. February 12th, 2021. Democrats paint Trump as danger in years to come.
Yeah.
Now, at this point, no one really thought that Trump would ever have a chance in hell again.
It
Right?
was over.
And yet, somehow, that's still the case. So, the next thing I kind of wanted to ask you is, now that you look at this, what do you think it tells us about time, about memory, about the way that we process information as a society?
So, for those who don't know, each of the day's drawings, as a way to kind of just ground myself, or to ground the art really, is paired with the New York Times headline from that day in that particular position. So I was not exercising any editorial decision making at all. I was just telling you what I was reading. And so what happens is, so the book is 365, so you get 365 consecutive days of reporting what the New York Times thinks is the most important story, right? So I made an editorial decision about which newspaper I chose, which was, I had to think
Good
about
choice.
that. I'll pay for the record, but I kind of had to think, well, you know, I guess I am revealing something about myself in that decision, but I didn't want it to be my personal thinking about what was important or not. I wanted it to be the Times telling me. And so when you look at this arc over time, you see how things change and how things stay the same. And it's kind of shocking to me how much things actually stay the same more than they change. It's a bit depressing. 3 years on, reading a lot of this, so it's 3 years since I began this, October 1st, 2020, so we're October 12th, 2023. We are still going into an election next year, which will be Trump versus Biden, right? Same. There are 2 weeks in the book where Hamas and Israel have not a war, but there's something going on that's reported every single day. And it was like a blip. It was like you read this and you're like, oh, that's weird. Okay. And now here we are. You know, I think that what I find interesting is actually it's this process of looking back. And I feel like we're in a culture that is very forward. You know, like it's partly the news. It's like, what's next? What's next? What's new? What's new? What's new? And there's never a moment, and I don't think as a culture we have actually processed what has happened 3 years ago. We just want to get on with things and move on. And so it's like, actually looking back, there's so much resonance still there. I was a little nervous about like I thought I wanted to get the book out sooner because I thought, oh, it's going to lose its emotional resonance. And actually it's the opposite. It's kind of grown over time because it's somehow you see, oh, the trauma is still there. And it's a bit shocking actually. And so it's not, so my thing about time, this is capturing time in some really deep way. Like, this is 6 months. That's what 6 months looks like. Those during hikes or a month looks like. That's what a day looks like. Okay, so it's a way to hold time, and it's a way to kind of not have it mush all into some, like just ocean and kind of just come together. You can see seeds being planted, you see things being resolved, you see things being not resolved, things coming back. But the lesson is if you don't deal with it, it's just going to keep coming. Because that's my lesson.
Perfect segue. Okay. Day 243, May 31st, 2021. Uneasy alliance may give Israel new leadership. Day 290, Europe's floods are latest signs of climate crisis. One of the things that I think really is interesting and works really well with this is that you do, if journalism is the first draft of history, art is collective memory, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so being forced to sort of sit with these things is part of what art makes us do in a way that journalism can't. And yet, now we have a book, right? And so this somehow exists between those two spaces, between what you look at on the wall and between what you read in the newspaper. So tell me a bit about that process.
Oh, so why a book? Well, books are really interesting. Like, it's a very private way to see something. You read a book individually. You look at a piece of work collectively. Like you can look at a piece of art, have a conversation with someone. You sit down, and as you look at a book, it's a conversation between me and the content of what is happening, and I'm sort of absorbing it. The other thing that a book allows you to do is like time. Each page is a day. It is much more linear, like time kind of can be. It has that kind of bit to it, like a day has to it. So I really wanted the sense of my lived experience of like, what is it like to live day after day after day after day? I'm so tired, I'm so bored, oh, that's interesting, oh, that's boring, whatever it is. And that seemed to be much truer to what it was like actually making the work. And that was it was also a way, it felt like a portal to connect to people viewing the work, that they're reading the work in the same way I was reading the work. And that seemed like really like a nice thing. And the other thing is it's an exhibition that you can carry around with you. It's very democratic. Books are much more like, people like books. Like pieces of art can be quite intimidating. Whereas a book is just a book, it sits on a shelf. It's a beautiful, it can be a beautiful sculptural object in and of itself. So I was sort of, from an artistic perspective, really wanting to push what a book could be. Like, is it a piece of art? How can we make it think? How can we make it unique? How can we make each copy unique, but at the same time be part of the whole? So, that theme of uniqueness, every day is unique, but it's part of a larger collective. It's, each individual is unique, but we're part of a larger whole. So it's that individual plus the collective, kind of trying to find expression to that through the form that the work ended up taking.
And this may be a question for either one of you. This is the question my daughter would ask, which is, why pink and green?
Well, you should ask Marcus, who was the graphic, who did the amazing design for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, why pink and green? Initially it was, like, we'd spent time with Nina, so the colours were informed somewhat, not personality, I don't know, but because when we spoke about it, you were like, they're not necessarily the colours I would have gone for, but they make sense.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it was looking at your world and something, it's almost like a subconscious thing.
Yeah.
They just sort of worked.
Yeah.
And they worked very well together. And it's funny because aesthetically, it's like, listening to you guys talk, it's like, I know it's like a quite traumatic year, but it's so beautiful. It's this juxtaposition. And I think that just sort of allowed someone to enter this world through the lens of beauty, also experience trauma.
Yeah.
You know, like without it being too full on.
Yeah.
You know, so
I think it works really well. I love it.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way to say it. It's
Yeah.
like the cover is this beautiful, like, come and look at this.
It's not-
lush.
Yeah.
Like, let me tell you how
Yeah.
terrible everything was.
But in many ways, all of this, there's studies in contrast, right? So you're
Yeah.
going color and black and white. You're going, modern, like new and old is the other thing that seems, right? A newspaper is new every day.
Yeah.
And art is something that can age well. And this is like an old technology, right?
Yeah.
And
Actually, this was printed outside Berlin in a town called Oldenburg on the oldest continuous printing press in the world. Established. That's impressive.
Yeah.
1595.
Okay, so this is like old technology. Yeah. And new technology.
exactly.
So
So
new materials as well.
Yeah.
Like it was so special, the linen that we chose. It's like when we were speaking to our print broker, it was just like, we were like, oh, the sheen on it, it's like unusual. Yeah, we got obsessed by micro details, but it is designed onto the micro details.
Yeah, everything's considered.
Yeah.
Like every little, like there are 1,000 decisions to make in a book.
There were a lot of
Even when every page is the same.
Another question. So, last question, and then maybe we can open up and see if anybody else has questions, because I'm sure they do. Old and new again. I'm curious how this informed work that followed. This is now
Yeah.
something you've sort of finished for a while.
Yeah.
How has it spoken to the other things you did after that, and what are you doing next, and how does that sort of all fit together?
Well, time is a big thing that I'm interested in. So how do people deal with passing of time? So this is my effort to capture a moment, passage of time in a more permanent type of form. But then I do installation. So that work behind you, which is over there, is an installation that can only live on that wall. So it will be destroyed at some point when it's ready, when they are sick of it, I guess. And so that has an obvious time ending. We don't exactly know when it will be. We know it's going to end, like everything in life, right? So I like to really sort of think, sort of have time as an ingredient, an active ingredient in the work, and it actually is quite upsetting to a lot of people, having to face the fact of, finite life and passage of time, because it's hard to think about. Again, we like to move forward and the new, the next, the uprising, and you don't like to think about the demise, the finish, the over. So yeah, I think that all of my work has this kind of element of time, thinking about things through, and then we're thinking about another book. I like working in series. I like doing things that are too much, excessive, stupid. And so abstract artist, and abstract work can be difficult sometimes for people to kind of connect with because it's so open-ended, really. It doesn't tell you what to think about it. But because this is connected with the news, everyone can connect to that. And so that's very exciting to me, to be able to do work that people can put themselves very personally into that story. And it's not, it becomes like, there's an intimacy with that, which is really special. So that's it.
This is the book. She'll buy it. And maybe we'll open up to other questions if other people have thoughts or questions.
Actually, I have two questions.
Yes.
The first one is, when you were going through this process of time and space, is there any page that disappointed you?
Like in the drawing?
Yeah.
I did make a mistake. There is
You mentioned it,
there is one point where I didn't line up the things properly. No, there's nothing that disappointed me. I think that I would have been disappointed if I didn't do it. I kind of set it up, so I was successful if I did it. Like, it was like the fact of doing it. And a large part of why I became an artist in the first place was to become less goal-oriented, ironically. It sounds like a system of
I'm sure that's what
but to become more present with what I was doing. So I wasn't going to be evaluating whether it was good or bad.
Okay.
It was just the doing of it that mattered. So each of the day, it was kind of like meditation. You know, it was like I wasn't making decisions. I just, you know, submitted, accepted, did it. And so yeah, there was no bad child in the corner that I was upset with.
It's often the case with artists, right? So,
Yeah.
and the second question, which is a bridge to your transfer, is you read the news and you do your job.
Yeah.
You go to work, as you said,
Yeah.
but you have emotion with this time and space because this affirmation gives you a message that you can be happy with, unhappy, angry, frustrated, scared.
Yeah.
Did this impact your drawing of the day?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what's interesting is when you read the book, so over time, if you do sit down and spend like 5 or 10 minutes just taking out a section and reading, after probably the 3rd or 4th page, you're trying to interpret the drawing in the context of it. Yeah. So it's our brain's way of trying to create patterns. So we're always trying to interpret, to narrativize. And so it doesn't, you know, this is an abstract grid, but I'm looking at a headline about Trump and there's like there's a section where it starts to separate and I think, oh, she must be really upset about that. And maybe it was, I don't know, you know, so much of this is subconscious. Like things are, the inputs are happening, you know, they're happening all the time and I can't, we're human, we're sensitive creatures, that's just part of it. I didn't think at the time I was drawing it that I was interpreting the headlines. I probably looked at the headlines at one point of the day, did drawings at another time of the day, but I think subconsciously, for sure it would be affecting it, but not in a way that I'm conscious of. Yeah, so but you should be conscious when you're reading the book of your desire to interpret.
Yeah, I saw a couple of news and I was like, maybe she's angry.
Like everyone, maybe people say, oh, she must have had a really tough day that day, or no, she's really calm that day. I don't know.
Thank you for
They
that.
become Rorschach tests.
Yeah, it's a Rorschach test, basically. Yeah.
So I fairly frequently wake up with ideas from my subconscious. My question is, how do you discriminate against which idea you follow through?
Yeah, that is another really good question. So does the idea hang around? So the way you describe, it's loads of ideas like they come, and then you're like, oh, I should do that. And then, like, if it's still there, like if it's like, you know, like tapping on my shoulder, then it's probably something I should pay attention to. But you don't have to pay attention to all that. It's like, you know, like I said, it's a proposition that you accept. You know, there'll be other propositions. And by accepting this proposition, I can't do the 20 other ideas that will come to me, you know. So it's all a trade-off. I know, that's what my coach says, it's all a trade-off. And so yeah, no, but yes, I mean, any artist will have a similar kind of answer to that, I imagine.
So was there a day that was more special to you in the 365 days, and why?
So the day that I chose to keep, you know, so when you buy a copy, you buy a date. So you buy a date, so it's an edition of 365, and each date of the year has a copy that comes with a drawing that was done on that date. So which dates did I choose? I chose August 20th, and it was actually one of the that was a day where I was upset, and you can see the schism, and that was kind of a moment of trauma for me, because that was the day my youngest son left home, and he flew to New York. We were in deep lockdown in Sydney. My whole family, my 2 sons and my husband were like in the United States, and I was, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
that was a day, that was actually,
Oh, that's great.
so that's the day that I could, because that was like a tear in the fabric. That was the tear in my personal fabric, and I don't even know what the headline was.
Tightening grip, Taliban silences foes and dissent.
That was the moment that the US was withdrawing from
Yes,
Afghanistan.
total shit.
So it was a shit show. It was
It was.
horrible. So yeah, so that was the date. That was the most important date. But that was like the tidal wave that I could see coming, and then it came.
Withdrawal? See, I'm making a narrative.
Yes.
I love that, and thanks for sharing the tear in the fabric, and hats off to showing up every day to the page. I'm curious about you said earlier, the choice of your own editorial to make the New York Times
Yeah.
the headline. because there's so much discern there, and how history is made and news is made, and you just touched upon it being in Australia as opposed to America.
Yeah.
And the New York Times is
American,
an American piece of news. How do you think about that when the news and the response to the pandemic in that year was so distinct in this country?
That's an excellent question. I really thought very hard about that decision. So I'm Australian. I lived in the United States for 16 years. My husband is American. I had 2 sons. They're both in the United States studying at university, or actually now just graduated. So the United States, I'm a US citizen and Australian citizen. So the United States is pretty close to me. Like, I care about what happens there in a very visceral way, personal way. However, the rest of the world actually cares about what happens in the United States too. And I mean, a lot of people here who are not American read the New York Times. So the Times has a reach that's global. So that kind of helped me rationalize it from a geographic perspective. Because I was like, well, I gotta choose, okay, the other option was I could choose different papers, you know, at different times, but I felt like I wanted this kind of single through line, this single kind of narrative and style, I guess, to lock it in. But the issue around, like, why the New York Times, why not the Wall Street Journal? Why the New York Times, why not the Financial Times? Why the New York Times, why not, you know, the LA Times or whatever? And we're in a world where it's naive to say there's not a line. And then, you know, there's a perspective, right? And people have different political, you know, people who live on different sides of the political spectrum, they're absorbing different views of the world through the media that they consume. So I kind of was like, well, the New York Times is the paper of record. It has the global reach. It has a lot of credibility. I mean, Trump hates the New York Times. He loves the New York Times. You know, he's like, he wants the New York Times' approval. And so I kind of said, well, that's the paper I read. You know, at some point, I kind of was like, well, I have to choose somewhere on the spectrum. What would be interesting is to choose a different publication and see how different the narrative is.
Well, I think it's funny because I was thinking that question,
Yeah.
and the truth is, you can look at this and use it in the same way to interpret the New York Times in a way too, right? So,
Yeah.
so I think there's an experience of that too, which we're totally open to, obviously. But I do think that it is a particular perspective.
Yeah.
And but in some ways, any choice you make would be a particular perspective.
Yeah, you
right?
can't
So-
avoid the choice at some
Yeah.
point, unless you say, oh, everything, you know, I can list all the papers, and it's like, then it's not art. Then it's,
Yeah.
you know, a
But
record.
it is, I mean, and like I said, I do think that this particular piece of the New York Times that you chose is the one that's the most selected, the most Timesian piece of the New York Times.
Yeah.
So it's a concentrated form of the New York Times. I kind of want to go back and see what it reveals about my own institution.
Yeah, well, no, I think
it's
that's,
value in that.
But did
Yeah.
you know that was the most important part of the?
well, I knew that I would get the paper when we lived in the US, and I would read it every day, and I think that was the one where my eye kind of
Well,
goes
it's a design
Yeah,
choice too,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So it's a design perspective that's built into the way that we read
Yeah.
newspapers. And at the
Yeah.
Times it's sort of done for a long time. Other papers have similar versions of something like that.
Yeah, so it's an intuitive thing, but, you know, there was. All right. Well, thank you so much,
Yeah.
everyone, for coming, and thank you.
It might seem reductive, but 3 points. I had a friend who once said to me, you've seen one Greek tragedy, you've seen them all, which was both shocking but also true. Secondly, I have a video of you deconstructing very gently one of your previous beautifully lined gold-striped installations. And thirdly, the intriguing notion that this came to you from your deep sleep, 4 a.m., the end of REM sleep. So you're processing stuff. And as I said, this might be reductive, but there's a quality about a little work which is about order. It's about containment and creating something that can be controlled out of even the chaos of the headlines. And I wonder how much of it is at a very highly refined level, an expression of that need to somehow make sense of the chaos and contain it.
Yeah, I think that's 100%. But as a psychiatrist. I must be pretty chaotic inside. I'm finding ways to manage it
Lessons
all.
you've done this in
The grid is my armature.
And it's a good time. The desire for order is universal.
Yeah, harmony, balance, order, things like that. All right, well, thank you
you.
so much.